The gunshot echoed across the Montana prairie like thunder rolling through distant mountains, sending Sarah Lowell into a desperate sprint toward the only shelter visible in the fading twilight, a weathered barn standing sentinel over a modest ranch. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her blonde hair streaked with dirt and blood that wasn't her own, as she lifted the heavy wooden latch with trembling fingers and slipped inside. Zachary Tucker's hand froze on the rifle he'd instinctively grabbed when he heard the barn door creak open at this ungodly hour. The year 1878 had brought nothing but trouble to Paradise Valley cattle rustlers, land disputes, and now apparently uninvited guests sneaking into his property after dark. Moving silently across the straw-covered floor, lantern held low, he followed the sound of panicked breathing to the far corner of the barn. The beam of light fell upon a young woman huddled behind a stack of hay bales, her green dress torn at the shoulder, her eyes wide with unmistakable terror. She looked like a cornered animal, pressing herself deeper into the shadows as he approached. "No one will hurt you here," Zach said, deliberately softening his voice as he lowered the rifle and set it against the wall. He raised his empty hands where she could see them. "Whatever you're running from, you're safe now." Grace Lowell didn't believe him, couldn't afford to believe anyone after what she'd witnessed tonight. The memory of her employer's body falling to the floor, the cold eyes of his killer turning toward her, sent fresh waves of panic through her exhausted body. "They'll find me," she whispered, her throat raw. "They'll know I saw." Zach crouched down, maintaining his distance. At 32, he'd seen enough of life to recognize genuine fear. This wasn't some elaborate trick. The woman was terrified for her life. "I'm Zachary Tucker. This is my ranch. Nobody comes onto my land without my say-so." He spoke with quiet authority, the kind that came from years of standing his ground against men far more intimidating than he appeared. "Who's after you?" Grace hesitated, weighing her limited options. The cowboy's face, illuminated by the warm glow of the lantern, was weathered but kind, strong features framed by dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, stubble shadowing a determined jaw. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-browned skin, held no malice. "Marcus Holloway," she finally said, the name bitter on her tongue. "I was housekeeper at his hotel in Bozeman. Tonight I saw him. He killed a man. A gambler who'd won too much." She swallowed hard. "He saw me watching. I ran." Zach's expression darkened. Holloway's reputation extended throughout the territory: wealthy, connected, dangerous. A man who considered himself above the law, and with enough friends in high places to make that delusion a reality. "You walked all the way from Bozeman?" he asked, calculating the 15 miles of rough country between his ranch and town. "Ran when I could. Hid when I heard riders." Her voice trembled. "Stole a horse for part of the way, but it threw me about 5 miles back." Zach nodded, impressed despite the circumstances. "You need food, rest, and those cuts tended to." He gestured to several small lacerations on her arms from crashing through underbrush. "I've got a cabin. It's not much, but there's a spare room and a lock on every door." Grace stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Because decent folks don't turn away someone in need," he said simply. "My mother taught me better than that before she passed. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "Holloway tried to buy my water rights last spring. Offered half what they're worth and threatened to make trouble when I refused. I reckon I already made my choice regarding that man long before tonight." That small admission, the shared enemy, seemed to ease something in Grace's posture. She allowed him to help her stand, though she swayed dangerously once on her feet. Without comment, Zach steadied her with a respectful hand at her elbow. "I've got nothing to pay you with," she said, straightening her shoulders with what remained of her dignity. "Everything I owned was in that hotel room. I'm not asking for payment." He retrieved his rifle and guided her toward the barn door, pausing to check the yard was clear before leading her across to the modest cabin. "Just don't steal my horse," he added with a gentle attempt at humor. "Good horses are hard to come by." The ghost of a smile touched her lips for the first time. I make no promises. I'm apparently a horse thief now. Zach's cabin was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, kitchen area, and small table. 2 doors led off to what Grace assumed were bedrooms. The windows were covered with sturdy wooden shutters, already closed against the night. Sit, he instructed, gesturing to a chair while he stoked the banked fire back to life. When did you last eat? This morning, Grace admitted, sinking gratefully into the chair. Zach moved efficiently around the small kitchen, setting water to heat and producing bread, dried beef, and preserves from his pantry. While she ate, he gathered medical supplies and clean cloths. May I? He asked, indicating her injured arms once she'd finished her simple meal. Grace nodded, watching closely as he gently cleaned each cut. His hands were calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was remarkably gentle. How long have you been here? She asked, partly from curiosity, partly to distract herself from the sting of the antiseptic. 8 years. Came west after the war with what was left of my family's money and bought this place when it was nothing but overgrazed pasture and a falling-down shack. Pride colored his voice. Got about 60 head of cattle now, good breeding stock. Built this cabin myself 3 years back. You live here alone? Got a ranch hand, Pedro, who helps with the cattle. He's got a small place over the rise. Otherwise, just me. He finished bandaging her arm. Lost my wife to fever our first year here. The simple statement held years of grief, presented matter-of-factly without self-pity. I'm sorry, Grace said quietly. Zach nodded acknowledgement. The spare room's through there. Clean sheets on the bed. Door locks from the inside. He stood, gathering the medical supplies. We can figure out what to do come morning. For tonight, just rest. Grace started toward the bedroom, then turned back. Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Zach, he corrected. Out here, formality seems a waste of breath. Zach, she repeated. I'm Grace. Sleep well, Grace, he said, watching as she closed the bedroom door behind her. He heard the lock click into place and nodded to himself. Trust would come slowly, if at all. He settled into the chair by the fire, rifle across his knees, prepared for a long night of watching over his unexpected guest. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the shutters when Grace awoke, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night crashed back, making her heart race before she reminded herself she was temporarily safe. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackling of the fire. She unlocked her door cautiously, finding the main room empty. A note sat on the table beside a covered plate. Gone to check cattle. Help yourself to breakfast. Stay inside. Back by midday. The simplicity of the note, and the consideration it showed brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. Grace ate the cold biscuits and preserves he'd left, then took stock of her situation. Her dress was torn and filthy. She needed clean clothing, money, and a plan to get far away from Montana territory. Holloway's reach was long, and once he discovered she was missing, he'd stop at nothing to silence her. She was examining her limited options when the door opened, startling her badly. Zach entered, looking apologetic. Didn't mean to frighten you, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Found something that might help. He produced a bundle of fabric from his saddlebag. Belonged to my sister. She left some things when she moved to California. Should fit well enough. Grace accepted the simple calico dress, surprised and touched by the gesture. Thank you. While she changed, Zach prepared a more substantial meal. The dress fit reasonably well, though it was slightly loose in the waist and short at the ankle. When she emerged, he gave her an appraising look. Better, he said simply. Sit. Eat. Then we need to talk. Over a hearty stew, Zach explained what he'd learned during his morning rounds. Riders came through early this morning, asking questions at the Wilsons' place down the valley. Looking for a young woman, said she was a thief who'd stolen from Holloway's hotel. His expression was grim. They're working their way up the valley, farm by farm. Grace's spoon clattered against her bowl. I need to leave. Now. And go where? Zach countered. They've got men watching the stage stops and the train station in Bozeman. Pedro heard it from his cousin who works at the livery. I don't know, she admitted, desperation edging her voice. But I can't stay here and bring trouble to your door. Zach studied her for a long moment. There's a U.S. Marshal supposed to be arriving in Bozeman tomorrow. Man named Cooper. He's been building a case against Holloway for months, land fraud mostly, but he'd surely be interested in murder. Hope flickered briefly in Grace's eyes before dying. My word against Holloway's? A housekeeper against the most powerful man in the county. No marshal would risk his career on that. Maybe not. But a witness and evidence might tip the scales. Zach leaned forward, his expression intent. What exactly did you see? Details matter. Grace closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive the terrible moment. Holloway was in his office with a man. I'd seen him at the poker tables earlier. They were arguing about money. The gambler Holloway called him Reynolds said he had proof the games were rigged. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I was bringing in Holloway's evening whiskey. They didn't notice me at the door. Holloway opened his desk drawer and pulled out a Derringer. Shot Reynolds point blank. She shuddered. Before he fell, Reynolds threw something papers, I think, into the fireplace. Holloway was trying to retrieve them when he saw me standing there. Zach considered this. So there might be evidence, partially burned but possibly still legible, in that fireplace. If no one's cleaned it yet, Grace agreed. But how would that help? I can't exactly walk back in there. No, Zach said slowly. But I might be able to. At her questioning look, he explained. I've got business in town tomorrow anyway. Spring supplies to order. No one would question me being there. Grace shook her head vehemently. It's too dangerous. Holloway knows everyone who comes and goes. He knows ranchers come to town for supplies, Zach countered. And he doesn't pay much attention to the likes of me. Too small time for his interest, except for my water rights. And if you're caught? Then I'll have a story about getting lost looking for the privy. His attempt at humor fell flat in the face of her genuine concern. More seriously, he added, I won't take unnecessary risks. But this might be your only chance at justice rather than a lifetime of running. Grace wanted to argue further, but the determined set of his jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she asked, What do I do while you're gone? Stay here. Pedro will keep watch from a distance. If trouble comes, there's a root cellar under the floorboards by the pantry. Last resort, only it's not comfortable, but it's well hidden. They spent the afternoon preparing. Zach showed Grace where he kept extra ammunition for the shotgun he insisted she learn to use in his absence. He was a patient teacher, and she proved a quick study, her determination to survive overcoming her initial fear of the weapon. As evening approached, a comfortable silence settled between them. Zach whittled by the fire while Grace mended her torn dress, using supplies from a small sewing kit he'd produced from a cupboard. You're good at that, he observed as her fingers worked deftly with the needle. My mother was a seamstress, Grace explained. She taught me everything she knew before consumption took her when I was 16. I wanted to follow in her footsteps, but there wasn't much call for fine sewing in the places I could afford to live. How did you end up working for Holloway? Grace's expression grew distant. My father died in a mining accident 3 years ago. Left nothing but debts. I'd been working as a laundress, but when the Granville Hotel advertised for a housekeeper with better wages, I couldn't pass it up. A bitter smile touched her lips. I needed the money to save for a ticket east. Thought I might find work in a proper dress shop in Chicago, or even New York. You still could, Zach said quietly. Once this is over. She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Perhaps. Though I'm beginning to see the appeal of open skies. The moment stretched between them until Zach cleared his throat and stood. Better get some rest. Tomorrow will come early. Dawn had barely broken when Zach prepared to leave for town. Grace stood awkwardly by the door as he checked his pistol and slipped it into his holster. "Be careful," she said, twisting her hands together. "If anything seems wrong, please just leave. Don't risk yourself for evidence that might not even be there." Zach paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Some things are worth the risk," he said simply. Before she could respond, he placed his hat on his head and was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The hours crawled by. Grace kept herself busy, cleaning the already tidy cabin, preparing food for Zach's return, and occasionally peering out the window at the quiet landscape. Pedro visited briefly, tipping his hat respectfully before returning to his watched position on the ridge overlooking the approach to the ranch. It was late afternoon when Grace heard riders approaching, too many for it to be just Zach returning. Her heart pounding, she grabbed the shotgun and peered cautiously through a crack in the shutters. 3 men on horseback, none of them Zach, were making their way toward the cabin. The lead rider she recognized immediately, Holloway's foreman, Davis, a cruel-faced man with a reputation for solving his employer's problems permanently. Grace moved quickly, retrieving the spare ammunition and a canteen of water before lifting the trapdoor to the root cellar. She descended into the cramped, earthy space and pulled the door closed above her just as boots thumped onto the porch. The voices above were muffled but audible through the floorboards. "Place looks empty," one man said. "Search it anyway," Davis ordered. "Tucker's in town, but that doesn't mean she ain't here." Grace held her breath as heavy footsteps moved across the cabin floor, directly over her hiding place. Someone opened cupboards, another moved into the bedrooms. She gripped the shotgun tighter, praying they wouldn't discover the cellar door beneath the worn rug Zach had placed over it. "Nothing," reported one of the men after several tense minutes. "Could be he's keeping her somewhere else. Or maybe she never made it this far. We'll check the barn," Davis decided. "Then head toward the Wilson place again. Someone in this valley's hiding her, and Holloway wants her found before that marshal starts asking questions." The men exited, and Grace allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She remained hidden, listening as they searched the barn, and eventually rode away. Only when complete silence had fallen did she cautiously push open the cellar door and emerge, muscles stiff from crouching in the confined space. Night had fallen by the time hoofbeats announced another arrival. Grace positioned herself by the window, shotgun ready, relaxing only when she recognized Zach's silhouette in the moonlight. She rushed to open the door, relief flooding through her. Zach's face was grim as he entered, but his expression softened at the sight of her. "You're all right," he said, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. "Holloway's men were here," she told him, helping him remove his dusty coat. 3 of them, led by Davis. "They searched the cabin, but the cellar stayed hidden." Zach nodded, unsurprised. "They're getting desperate." "Holloway knows the marshal arrived early. He was already asking questions when I got to town." He reached into his shirt and carefully extracted several charred paper fragments wrapped in a handkerchief. "Found these in the fireplace." Reynolds was smarter than Holloway gave him credit for. Grace stared at the blackened paper in wonder. "You actually did it." "Wasn't as difficult as I expected," Zach admitted, laying the fragments on the table. "The hotel was busy with the marshal's arrival. I claimed I was considering booking a room for some Eastern relatives visiting next month. No one paid me any mind, and Holloway's office was unlocked." Together, they carefully arranged the burned pieces. Though partial, the documents clearly showed altered figures and what appeared to be a scheme to cheat investors in Holloway's newest venture, a mining operation that existed primarily on paper. "Reynolds must have been documenting the fraud," Grace said. "That's what Holloway couldn't allow to get out. And with your testimony about the murder." Zach let the implication hang in the air. "It might be enough," Grace finished. Hope, fragile but real, blossomed in her chest. "We need to get these to the marshal," Zach nodded. "At first light. It's too dangerous to travel at night with Holloway's men patrolling." They ate a simple dinner, the atmosphere between them charged with anticipation and something deeper neither was ready to name. As they cleaned up, their hands brushed, and Zach's fingers lingered against hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Grace," he began hesitantly, "when this is over." A rifle shot shattered the window, sending them both diving for cover. More shots followed, splintering the doorframe and embedding in the cabin walls. "Davis must have doubled back," Zach said grimly, crawling toward his rifle. "Get down, stay low. There's at least 3 of them," Grace whispered, clutching the shotgun. "Maybe more." Zach moved to the shattered window, carefully peering out. 4, he corrected. "They're spread out, using the trees for cover." He fired a warning shot, forcing one of the attackers to duck behind a water trough. "Tucker!" Davis's voice rang out from the darkness. "Send the woman out, and you might live through the night. Holloway just wants what's his." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Zach called back, his voice steady despite the danger. "And she's under my protection now." A barrage of gunfire answered him, forcing both Zach and Grace away from the windows. They retreated to the relative safety of the bedroom, where the walls were thickest. "The root cellar," Zach suggested, keeping his voice low. "If you can make it there, I'm not hiding while you face them alone." Grace interrupted fiercely. "I got you into this. We face it together." Their eyes met in the dim light, understanding passing between them. Zach nodded once, respect evident in his expression. "Together, then. But we need a plan better than waiting for them to rush us." He thought for a moment, then asked, "How good are you with that shotgun now?" "Good enough to hit something the size of a man if he's close," she answered honestly. "That'll have to do." Zach outlined his strategy quickly. When the attackers grew impatient and began moving closer to the cabin, Zach was ready. He fired strategically, keeping them at bay while Grace positioned herself at the back window as they'd planned. One of Holloway's men attempted to circle around, thinking to enter through the supposedly unguarded rear of the cabin. When he approached the window, Grace fired both barrels of the shotgun. The man went down with a cry, wounded but alive. The diversion worked. While the other attackers were momentarily distracted by their comrades' shouts, Zach slipped out through a side window and circled behind them, using the darkness and his intimate knowledge of the property to his advantage. The first man never knew what hit him as Zach brought the butt of his rifle down on his head. The second managed to turn but found himself staring down the barrel of Zach's pistol before he could raise his own weapon. "Drop it," Zach ordered. "Now." Davis, realizing his position was compromised, fired wildly in Zach's direction. The bullet grazed Zach's arm, but his return shot caught Davis in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Within moments, it was over. 3 men wounded, 1 unconscious, all disarmed and secured with rope from the barn. Grace rushed out to Zach, her face pale in the moonlight as she examined his bleeding arm. "It's nothing," he assured her, wincing only slightly as she bound the wound with a strip torn from her petticoat. "Barely a scratch. A scratch that could have been much worse," she chided, though her hands remained gentle on his skin. Pedro arrived shortly after, having heard the gunfire from his cabin. He helped secure the prisoners more thoroughly and agreed to ride for the town sheriff at first light. Inside the cabin, as they barricaded the broken door and windows as best they could, the reality of what they'd just survived began to sink in. Grace found herself trembling, delayed shock setting in. Zach noticed immediately, guiding her to sit by the fire and wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "It's over," he murmured, settling beside her. "You're safe now. Because of you," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You risked everything for a stranger." "Not a stranger," Zach corrected softly. "Not anymore." The crackling fire cast golden light across their faces as they sat together, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Tentatively, Grace reached out, her fingers brushing against his uninjured arm. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Zach covered her hand with his own. Marshal Cooper will want your testimony. With these documents and those men in custody, Holloway won't escape justice this time. And after? Her question held more than simple curiosity. Zach's eyes, blue and steady in the firelight, met hers. That depends on what you want, Grace. Chicago and New York are still out there, if that's your dream. Dreams change, she said simply. Sometimes the unexpected path leads exactly where you need to go. Understanding dawned in Zach's expression. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. Stay, he whispered. Not because you need protection, or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because this place could use a woman's touch. Because I'd like to see what might grow between us, given time and care. Grace closed the remaining distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tender kiss that held promise and possibility. When they parted, she smiled the first genuine, unfettered smile since he'd found her hiding in his barn. Yes, she said simply. The trial that followed became the talk of Montana Territory for months. With Grace's testimony, the recovered documents, and several of Holloway's men turning against him in exchange for leniency, Marcus Holloway was convicted of murder and fraud. The man who had once seemed untouchable was sentenced to hang, though he ultimately died in prison before the sentence could be carried out, taken by typhoid fever during his second winter behind bars. Grace found unexpected purpose in the aftermath. Her clear-headed testimony and courage inspired other victims of Holloway's schemes to come forward. The marshal, impressed by her resolve, asked her to help organize the documents for the additional cases that emerged. Through it all, Zach remained steadfastly by her side, accompanying her to Bozeman for the trial, standing tall beside her as hostile eyes followed her through town. His quiet strength became her anchor, just as her determination and resilience earned his deepest admiration. They were married the following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the valley and new calves dotted the expanding Tucker ranch. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn herself, having established a small but growing business creating clothing for families throughout the valley. Her skills as a seamstress, once merely a dream, had become a reality that complemented their ranching income. On their first anniversary, as they sat together on the porch of the cabin now expanded to include a proper parlor and nursery for the child, Grace carried Zach presented her with a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the cover. "Our story," he explained. "From the beginning. I thought our children should know how their mother's courage changed everything. How sometimes the darkest moments lead to the greatest blessings." Grace opened the journal, finding the first page inscribed in Zach's neat handwriting. "She found shelter in my barn, but grace and strength in her own heart. And I found in her everything I never knew I was missing." Tears blurring her vision, Grace closed the journal and leaned against her husband's shoulder. The setting sun painted the valley in gold and crimson, their cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. From catastrophe had come this unexpected gift, a love born of courage and kindness, growing stronger with each passing day. "No one will hurt you here," Zach had promised on that first frightening night. He'd kept that promise. And in the safety of his protection, Grace had flourished, bringing light and purpose back to a man who'd forgotten how to hope. Together they built something neither could have created alone, a home where trust and love formed foundations stronger than any storm could shake. As darkness settled over the land they both now called home, Grace took Zach's hand and placed it over her growing belly, where their child shifted beneath his palm. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, but faced together, with the strength they'd discovered in each other's arms.